Alright, welcome to this probably rather short unscripted review of Tiny Tina's Wonderland. As to exactly how long, I'm actually not quite certain. It's basically as long as it takes to say what I have to say about the game and showcase a little bit of the gameplay, I suppose. There shouldn't be an overly excessive amount of things to cover. It is an unscripted review, on the other hand, which has a propensity to get a little bit rambly at points, so we'll see how it goes, I suppose. Bottom line is that if you want a concise, structured and highly efficient review, this isn't the video for you. All good? Great. This is the latest game in the Borderlands franchise, of course. Well, for the moment anyways. Albeit that won't be the case for much longer, considering Borderlands 4 is coming out in 12th of September, if I'm not mistaken. So that's just in a few days here, like a couple of weeks or something. So yeah. Fancy background, you got that. Either way, just like all Borderlands games, it is of course developed by Gearbox Studios, and it was released in 2022, I believe. Yes, correct. Anyways, it was of course published by 2K as per usual. I mean, they hold the intellectual property rights to the game franchise and universe, so you would sort of expect that, I would assume. Really isn't that much more to cover when it comes to that, I don't think. It's not a particularly obscure game, so it's probably not that surprising, let's be honest. It's a pretty fancy background though, I have to say. Things are happening. Yeah, so without much further ado though, gonna quickly look at the option menu. There isn't all that much to show you here really, at least for anybody who's even remotely familiar with previous Borderlands games. But after that I'm just gonna jump into the game and show you what's going on. So it is basically what you have come to expect from previous Borderlands games ever since Borderlands 2, I would say. Borderlands 2 honestly had a pretty decent PC port and had pretty good option menu, and it is nothing different here, right? Everything's rewindable, which is very nice. Even the controllers are unbindable, which is also very nice. I do appreciate that. That has not always been the case, especially back in the day when perhaps accessibility was a little bit less of a priority, even for bigger games. Nowadays, I've seen that it has gotten a little bit more common with rebindable controls and controllers. And this is obviously very useful if you have like a custom controller as well, considering that's a pretty big part of accessibility. Otherwise, difficulty settings, tutorials, you can have a little bit of HUD customization. There's nothing extensive there, honestly. Network and social, of course, is the same as previously. Basically, it works in the similar way. We have some accessibility options here as well for things such as people who are deaf or colorblind and such similar issues that you might have, which is always nice. I do appreciate when they have accessibility options. Games are, after all, one of those activities you can actually partake in even though you have certain handicaps or disabilities and so on and so forth. So, you know, why not try to accommodate that as best as possible, basically? Don't see any reason not to, especially for single player games. So yeah, it's nice that it's there. That dice almost hit us. Separate audio sliders for all the different volumes, as you can see here, which is obviously good. We have most options here, as you see, you know, vertical sync and resolution scaling. I actually basically never used that because it just hasn't been relevant or necessary, I suppose. And FOV, of course, which is very useful for all FPS games. And it has existed in basically all Borderlands games at this point. I think aside from Borderlands 1, if I'm not mistaken. That's pretty much it when it comes to options, and nothing much more to say about that, honestly. Social, that's the matchmaking stuff. Shift basically works the same as in previous Borderlands games, more or less, I would say. You can have a LAN, which is nice, I suppose. Always nice to have the ability to do that, albeit it's hardly an advanced feature. But yeah, this is very similar to the previous Borderlands games, so there isn't all that much to really show here, quite frankly. But this is how the interface looked like, so there you go. So yeah, I'm just gonna jump into the game and show a little bit what's going on. I've gotten a decent bit into the game, I believe. About somewhere around halfway, slightly beyond halfway, I would say. Probably, something like that, give or take. Yeah. Level 33, as you see here. At level 40, you unlock the kind of meta game perk leveling bullshit that's not directly connected to the main leveling stuff. So yeah, relatively late game, basically. But yeah, let's go. Loading. It doesn't take too long to load the levels, but it does take a little while. It's reasonable. It's totally fair, especially for the loaded levels. For the small levels, it's a bit excessive sometimes, but yeah. Nevertheless, welcome to the Wonderlands. I'm actually just gonna teleport back to the hub, I think, and start off there, so I can show you a little bit about the basics of the games, I suppose, and stuff like that. You can access the main hub from anywhere in the game, by the way. And you can also teleport back to the nearest kind of spawn point as well from this kind of main hub. So yeah, all right. Loading. It is a little bit tiresome to sit in 2 loading screens subsequently, to be frank. That's fair enough, but you know, it's not necessarily intended, I guess. So that's kind of my fault, I suppose. So the reason I say I wasn't that sure just how long this game would take to cover is essentially because it is... Good God, the textures are taking long to load in. Right, where am I? Yeah, it's because this game is very much, well, it's essentially Borderlands with a fantasy RPG skin and narrative and story, right? Setting in general, obviously. Whether or not that's good or bad is entirely personal preference, but that is what you're getting, just so you are aware of that. The game, in essence, mechanically, gameplay-wise, I mean, it's Borderlands. There's very little difference between this game and Borderlands 3, and 2 and the pre-sequel as well, albeit the difference between 2 and the pre-sequel to 3 is larger than between this one and Borderlands 3, especially mechanically. And when it comes to the movement and the shooting, actually, to some degree as well, there was a bit of an upgrade from the second one and the pre-sequel one, because the pre-sequel one was based on the second one, of course, and to Borderlands 3. But this one is basically the same as Borderlands 3 when it comes to the systems and the mechanics and the movement and so on and so forth. Now, there is a few smaller differences, of course, and that's what I'm going to showcase, obviously, in this video and talk a little bit about. But just to be completely clear right from the offset, this is Borderlands. If you don't like Borderlands, if you're not interested in Borderlands, this game is not going to be interesting to you. You're, of course, welcome to listen in and watch the video anyways, but don't be surprised if I say that this is Borderlands, and if you don't like Borderlands, you're not gonna like this game, because that's very much the case, right? Just gonna be clear with that right from the offset. So this is a kind of auto-collect loot box, which is a little bit weird in how it works. Then we have the character customization station here, I guess, which is, of course, you can customize your appearance and costume and so on and so forth. You can actually change your voice as well. Yeah, the auto looter is a bit weird. It collects like items you have not picked up, but it's a bit inconsistent, and sometimes it contains duplicates, it seems, and so on and so forth. So it's a bit odd and doesn't seem entirely consistent. So if you want to be sure you have a weapon, just see to it they pick it up by hand. Then we have that premium loot box. Obviously you need a key for that one. And then we have the normal vending machines, which work the same as they've done in previous games. It's a shop, essentially. Yeah, the premium loot box is obviously one you buy a key for real money, which is as awful as always been. But it has existed since Borderlands 2, and it doesn't seem like they are particularly interested in removing it either, so it's gonna be there, I guess. And then we have one last thing to show, which is the thing right over here, which is where you can upgrade your inventory slots and stuff. In this case, you are using normal money. You're not using like iridium or whatever that you used in Borderlands 2, so everything in this game is purchased with the loot monies that you get through your adventures. It's all about them gold coins. Alright, I think that pretty much does it though. That's what you have in this game when it comes to the hub here. Again, everything is basically the same as it's been in the previous games. I think the only one that's new is the loot gather thing, which again like gathers some of the loot that you miss sometimes. You also have this portal which basically teleports you back to where you last came from. Well, it teleports you to the, again, as I said before, mentioned previously, it teleports you to the closest kind of save point thing. But I'm not actually going to use that. Instead, I am going to go to the overworld, because that's one of the things that's a little bit unique with this one. Well, unique in comparison to the other games at least, or different, because, it's a board game. So yeah, pretty neat. It's pretty simple, to be honest, but it's still pretty neat that they are really committed to the theme. I can actually enter a camp. I've never done that. I've never had to do that for like a quest or anything, actually. So far, anyways. There you go. It's a normal combat encounter, I guess. There you go. I guess I might as well just talk a little bit about combat then. Why not? So yeah, as you're going to see here, the combat is very similar to the previous Borderland games. There is a couple of minor differences or additions. But if you jump into the inventory here, as you see, this looks basically the same, more or less. But there is a few differences. I'm just going to take that skin there. So one of the differences in this game is that melee combat is much more emphasized, essentially, right? So there is melee weapons in the game. All the characters can equip melee weapons. They have different effects, they have status effects, they have all that kind of stuff. Much similar to a normal weapon. That's obviously not something that existed in the previous games. In the previous games, your melee was very much a secondary attack. Even for characters like Zero, which in Borderlands 2, right, the assassin, even then the melee weapon was obviously not an equipable weapon. You couldn't really modify it outside of just leveling up your character. So yes, some characters had a little bit more focus on the melee attack, but it's just much more emphasized in this game, right? You have an actual weapon slot for your melee weapon, as opposed to previously, right? So melee weapons are a bigger part of the combat, and they very much do combo together with your different ranged weapons as well, of course, similarly to previously with the characters that did have those abilities and had a little bit more melee focus and stuff like that. So that's a bit of a difference. Now the second thing, or the second biggest thing that this game has, is spells. So spells essentially replaces grenades, right? Now the thing about this is that the difference is actually a little bit lesser than you might think. But here's the spell book, right? It gives you a spell that you can cast in the same way that you can cast a grenade, essentially. Aside from the fact that you don't have a amount in this case, you can just cast them when they're off cooldown. You don't actually have a mana bar or anything like that either. It's just a recharge rate. Now, the thing is that since the previous Borderlands had the addition of grenade mods, which are these things, obviously, that kind of affects or modifies how your grenade acts, often in rather odd or unique ways, the difference between that and these spells are a little bit lesser than if you would have had just a normal grenade, right? But in the case of Borderlands, with all the grenade mods, they had everything from cluster grenades to some kind of like teleporting grenades and lifesteal grenades and turret grenades, I'm pretty sure. So this was already a very wide range of different things you could do with them, even before. Now, the spells in this game are yet more diversified, I guess. You have all the standard things that you might expect. You have like ice spikes, and you have magic missiles, you have meteors or smaller meteors, you have kind of mini eruptions or area effect things, so yeah. It's pretty cool. Then we also have these rings. These are similar to the... What are those called again? Artifacts, I guess, that you had in the previous games. They give you a little bit of percentage boost for something. You can equip a little bit more of these kind of things. And then you have the armor, which is basically the replacement for the character mods that existed in the previous games. So these boosts your different abilities, basically. You have a few more of these, obviously, because you have like a necklace, you have 2 ring slots. The second ring slot isn't really unlocked particularly early, right? So you usually just have 1 for basically throughout the entire first playthrough, I guess. But yeah, I haven't unlocked it yet anyways, and I'm pretty late. Now, the skills, well, these are basically the same as previous Borderlands games. So we have a character menu. Well, you pick a character, you have a skill tree, and you have a ability, basically, for each character. In this case, you have 2 abilities per character, but you can only activate 1 at a time. The reason I have 2 of these is because later in the game, around mid-game, you get to choose another kind of character to add, so you're like a mixed character, but it's not that different because you can still just activate 1 of these kind of special abilities that you active abilities, right? And then you can just plop on even more passive abilities, basically, and combine different characters. In this case, I have chosen to take Stabomancer and Spore Warden, which are basically, well, Stabomancer is a little bit more focused around melee, I suppose, and the Spore Warden is primarily focused around ranged combat, if I remember correctly. Yes. Anyways, then we have the Myth rank. Again, this is the kind of post-level perks, and this is just, you know, quests. Let's continue fighting though. So yeah, when it comes to the weapons, they are very much inspired, or yeah, so the way the game is always set up is that basically Tiny Tina acts as a dungeon master for the board game that you are playing. And much like you would expect perhaps from a child that is acting as a dungeon master, she will take a lot of inspirations from the real Borderlands world, which is kind of clever and a kind of convenient way to be able to actually use things that exist in the real Borderlands world, I guess. But at the same time, it also makes sense, you know? That's pretty much what I would expect from a kid that is acting as a dungeon master. So if you look at the weapons here, you obviously see that these are just the normal kind of weapon producers in the real Wonderland games. So this is obviously Dahl, the guy that makes these kind of military style burst weapons often. Then we have Jacobs, basically. We have Tidior, Torge, so on and so forth. Hyperion, of course. So we basically have all the standard weapon manufacturers, but they are, well, I guess, fantasyized with a slightly different name. So yeah, but it also makes sense. I mean, it's narratively cohesive that you take inspiration from the real world. Now, as you see here, this is a kind of weird acting weapon. This is a Hyperion SMG, obviously. So it does reduce recoil the more you fire, which is the kind of unique thing about Hyperion weapons. Which is kind of cool. It is kind of cool, though, that just in general, the kind of way that different manufacturers have, like, specific characteristics, I guess, to the weapons, right? So Hyperion has this reverse recoil, Torch has explosive weapons, etc. I mean, it gives some character to the world. I really like that. Anyways, as you see though, the kind of spread pattern on this gun is pretty weird. And when it comes to the weapons in general, they are a little bit more diversified, I guess. They are a little bit crazier, especially the normal weapon or standard weapons. So even just rare weapons have those kind of weird spray patterns, while when you perhaps play Borderlands 2 and 3, it would only be the more unique weapons that had truly unique characteristics in that sense, I guess. And it was more common, or it was less common with those kind of spray patterns, and it was more common with just standard acting weapons, or more standard acting weapons. Anyway, so yeah, I'm just gonna run around a little bit here in the overworld, I guess. Having left that topic, when it comes to the overworld, this is basically how you traverse the world. The game does not have any kind of vehicles at all. It doesn't have fast travel, actually. No, not really. It has fast travel within the levels, but aside from that, you will have to use this overworld map instead. But you move pretty freaking quickly with this, honestly. So it doesn't take too long anyways. I guess it takes slightly longer, I guess, but yeah, that's fine. There is some minor loot here as well, but it's mostly just coins. And then we have a few other interactable things here. Other than that, this area, as I said, just basically acts as the overworld map, right? So you run to different dungeons or different areas and fight enemies and basically progress through this. So yeah. And you will get different items so you can get past gated places, essentially, and thereby progress. So yeah. But you get the items themselves through doing actual like dungeons or areas or completing clearing areas and stuff like that. Those little shrines basically just complete dungeons, you get shrine pieces and then you activate them to get some kind of bonus. So that's what those are. Otherwise there isn't that much more to say about the overworld. It is mostly just for traversal between the different areas. They have a few little cool details, I guess. If you walk in the tall grass, you can kind of encounter a random encounter. Sometimes when you open one of those chests, they are mimics. This is an example of a gated place. Basically just progress further throughout the story and you will eventually get whatever you need in order to unlock those gates, whether it's some kind of magical items or not. So yeah, an example actually is this, as you see here, this is gonna create a bridge. You don't have that ability from the beginning, but when you kind of get a special pair of spectacles or some shit like that, you will get the ability to do that. And you just walk through those and you have access to this one, for example, which will be the next area, I think. You can just punch the enemies that you encounter, by the way, in case you're actually not in the mood to fight, which I don't really want to do right now because I already done such a battle in the camp. So I think it's better to just go into an actual area instead and show you a little bit how that looks. These are obviously much bigger than the kind of arenas that you fight with the random encounters and the camps and mini dungeons and stuff like that. So these actual areas, these main areas basically, that you go throughout the main quests and stuff, these are very much similar to the areas in Borderlands, such as Wildlife Preserve, for example. They are reasonably big. They aren't huge, but they're pretty big. I think the planets in Borderlands 3 probably were a little bit bigger, honestly. I'm pretty certain. But they are probably about the size as Borderlands 2, I would say, being one contained area in Borderlands 2. Yeah, pretty much the same size as an area in Borderlands 2, I would say. They're much bigger than those arenas at any rate. So I'm just gonna clear out my inventory right now, and just marking them up for trash, by the way, if you're curious as to what I'm doing, because I've filled up my inventory with useless shit, which is just part of the course for Borderlands, I suppose. But yeah, you just mark them up basically, and then you can just quick sell them at any given vending machine, essentially, and that's pretty much it. It's pretty simple. It is very much worthwhile collecting the loot in this game though, because as you saw previously, and as I showed you, and as I said, everything is purchased with gold, so, you know, looting things and selling them is actually very much worthwhile. It's not like in Borderlands 2 where it's like, well, I only need the kind of inventory expansions and everything else I collect in loot, so then I don't need gold. Well, that's not the case in this game. Everything is purchased with gold, everything. Which means obviously that you should never ignore gold, basically. Not at least not if you want to be even moderately efficient with how you play, I guess. Which some people will be less or more concerned with, I suppose. I mean, it is a little bit busy work to loot and sell, obviously, but when you have collected enough loot, you can obviously expand your inventory to where it's not that big of a deal, at least. You just collect and fill up your entire inventory and just go through it once in a while. And the fact that you can kind of mark them up in your inventory while also comparing it to what you currently have equipped and that kind of stuff, does make it a little bit more convenient as well, I would say. So that's kind of nice. Anyways, let's just murder these crabs. That pretty much covers it when it comes to the combat and systems and what's actually different in this game as opposed to the previous one, being Borderlands 3 of course. And when it comes to Borderlands, I would assume most people have a pretty decent idea of what it entails, right? It's a pretty standard FPS looter shooter. A lot of focus around different kind of crazy weapons and to some degree co-op gameplay as well, certainly. I haven't been playing co-op Borderlands to any greater extent personally, mostly just because I don't have that many friends that happen to play Borderlands, basically. Most things are more fun with friends, of course, but other than that, isn't that much more to say about that topic, I don't think. Otherwise, it has all the strengths and weaknesses of the previous Borderlands games when it comes to its combat and systems. There is a lot of loot in the game, so that's fun for those who like a lot of loot. And for some people, to some degree, I would actually classify myself into this category. It feels a little bit oversaturated, honestly. You really don't need quite as much loot as you get, and I would be entirely fine to get 5 really interesting and useful weapons, as opposed to 20, of which 5 are actually useful and the rest is just, I don't know, things you can sell, I suppose. This comes to a little bit of an issue I have, I guess, with the loot in Borderlands in general, which is that after the first portion of the game, the very beginning, green weapons and white weapons become essentially just useless. You will never use them because rare weapons and epic weapons and legendary weapons are so much more useful, so you're never gonna find a situation, essentially, where you would like to use a common weapon. They're just worse. And I think that's a little bit of a shame, because the common weapons still have a skin, they still have a distinct look to them, usually. They look a little more plain, right? They look more conventional, but it's still kind of nice. I mean, I don't have anything against a conventional looking revolver now and then. It can be fun to use that for a little while as well. But you would just never do it. It's incredibly inefficient. It's pointless, it's useless, right? Like, functionally, that's a bad idea. Strategically, it's stupid. You should not use those. But that just means that there's like half the loot in the game is essentially just worthless padding, right? You pick them up and you sell them, but you don't do anything else with them. You never use them. They're just not useful at all, ever, essentially. This has been a bit of a problem in the previous games as well, to some degree, but I do feel it's been exaggerated somewhat in the later titles. In Borderlands 2, I could still find situations where I would use a common weapon, because maybe my previous rare weapon of that type had been outleveled to such a degree that even a common weapon would be more powerful than that one. But in the later titles, it seems the rare weapons are so common, or comparatively common, that it's just, I never find myself in a situation where that's the case anymore. It's not a situation that seems to ever materialize. At least not anymore. Not for me anyways. So yeah, I just never really find myself in a situation where I ever use a weapon that is common or below. Which is a little bit of a shame, because they have their own aesthetics and styles and designs, but there's just no reason to ever use them. They're just categorically obsolete for the most part. At least statistically and from the perspective of use. But yeah, the game basically has all the strengths and weaknesses of previous Borderland games. It's an FPS looter shooter, of course, which tends to mean that enemies have a little bit more health and take a little bit more bullets than in more realistic FPS games, which can make the weapons feel a little bit weaker when compared to more realistic FPS games, that is, which makes complete sense, because if you shoot something 500 times and it dies as opposed to 3 times, then your guns and weapons probably won't feel quite as powerful. For the most part, of course, it will obviously vary between games to some degree. It can make the guns feel somewhat meek and weak. I do have a certain predilection for the more realistic style of shooting myself. I tend to prefer when the guns really feel powerful and impactful, and you have to be careful where you place your shots. But with that said, I can certainly appreciate the type of combat you find in these games as well. It tends to be a little bit more laid back and less intense, so it really depends on what you're in the mood for. The all-around graphical design of the game is of course very similar to previous games as well. It's Borderland graphics. Colorful, cartoony, shell-shaded, somewhat comic book style in nature. It looks fine, and it looked fine in 2012 when Borderlands 2 came out as well, for that matter. And while the graphical fidelity has seen some improvement in the later titles, it still shouldn't be any problems for most people to run it, I would think. Which certainly is a benefit, and it's a benefit of having a unique art style in general, honestly. You can spend more time on the artistic presentation and less processing power on rendering the highest fidelity graphics possible. And it makes the game available for a wider range of hardware as well. But with that said, let's listen a little bit to what this guy has to say, shall we?
The Three Sisters. You must stop them singing their intoxicating siren song. They lured my men into their foul nest, and unto their doom I'm sure of it. I wish I could have saved them my own self, but I got trapped here when the whole bloomin' drink exploded and dropped this flotsam on me. Was it jetsam? Either way, please. Oh, put my men out of their encorsed misery and in those twisted witches before they do more harm.
I've always wanted to hear a song so intoxicating it lures men to their doom.
Just so we're clear here, that now-dead pirate was talking about sirens, right? As in the dangerous women that lure sailors to doom via drowning?
And not the magical ladies who are very real in our world.
Yepskis, you got it. Look at you.
There you go, that's some dialogue. I'm gonna let you listen to a little bit more later, of course, as well, to give you a little bit better sense of how it sounds and how it feels, but it's certainly very similar to the previous games. That being said, though, I think it's about time to move on to talk a little bit about the story and narrative and setting anyways, so let's do that. All around, it delivers the same typical Borderland-esque writing, narrative, comedy, and overall tone that you expect from these titles. The story itself sets you in the perspective of the player of a fantasy RPG tabletop game with Tiny Tina as the dungeon master. It's thematically consistent and committed, which is nice. Everything very much does take place within the confines of this kind of tabletop game. Everything in the story is made up and constructed by Tiny Tina, and you are playing with 2 other characters, as you saw previously in the dialogue, who are basically just playing with you. Well, they're actually not playing their own characters, they're just providing counsel and guidance, I suppose, and a bunch of complimentary commentary. Either way, a lot of the aspects of the kind of in-game world of the Borderlands world here is inspired by the real-world Borderlands world, I guess, or whatever you want to call it, which is kind of interesting and neat. As I mentioned before, it's kind of what I would expect from, like, if you have a kid being a dungeon master for a board game. I would expect them to draw a lot from the real world they are inhabiting and derive a lot of information and inspiration from that. And that's kind of what's happening here as well, right? In addition to just references to the Borderlands world, it also has references to actual real world fiction and literature. And sometimes entire quests are just like big giant reference to some kind of pop culture fiction or something like that. This is by no means something that's new for the Borderlands franchise, and it's not something that previous game has been shying away from by any means, but it's slightly more exaggerated here, I suppose. In the previous games, you usually didn't have entire quests that were basically a big giant reference to a certain fictional character or something like that. But in this game, that very much does exist. With the whole story being a tabletop adventure though, it's also less serious and more light-hearted overall, so it kind of makes sense. That and these real-world references tend to deliver some of the more amusing and interesting writing I see in this game, so you're not gonna hear any complaints about that from me. And quite honestly, if you're taking the story of a Borderland game very seriously and somberly, you're probably doing something wrong. But that's obviously just my perspective. And to be fair, the Borderlands franchise do have a number of legitimately heartfelt moments. They're just rather scarce and not that prevalent. At least not for most of the experience. The game features the same kind of commentary and narration you expect from the Borderlands franchise by this point. Whether or not that's something you appreciate is of course very much a question of personal preference. I've never really been a huge fan of the comedy and writing in Borderlands myself. It's been a little bit off and on. I did find Handsome Jack to be an absolute brilliant villain. At the same time, I do find a lot of the jokes and comedy in the Borderlands franchise to be rather, well, immature, stupid and obnoxious. But again, that's very much a personal preference thing. Some people adore it, I'm sure. Me personally, I'm not a huge fan of it. There is some legitimately funny jokes and commentary, and I do have to say that in respect to this game, the real-world references can be rather amusing sometimes, frankly. But there is also a lot of meaningless blabber and pointless gobbledygook as well, as far as I'm concerned. So basically, I find the commentary and narration and overall story and narrative of Borderlands to be very variable in quality. The jokes are very much hit or miss. The references can sometimes be funny and sometimes they're pretty stupid. And quite often, when the jokes don't hit, they're just boring. They really don't tend to be offensive or objectionable in any way, really. They don't tend to go much into politics or controversial issues, honestly, as far as I can tell, anyways. But that's just my perspective, of course. I'm sure someone can be offended by something if you really try. I mean, everything is offensive nowadays, I guess, so, you know, I wouldn't be particularly surprised. But anyways, the thing with Borderlands is that if the comedy and jokes don't work for you, it doesn't have that much more to offer in way of a narrative. It's not particularly deep or insightful, really, let's be honest. It's not like it has a very intriguing and complex narrative, and it's not like it has a profound message behind it. The story and narrative itself is very simple. The thing that gives it its kind of flavor and flair, well, it's the comedy. It's the writing style. It's not the actual substance of the story itself. Which also means that if you don't find it funny at all, well, you're not going to derive any kind of value from the story or from the narrative at all, basically. It's gonna be pretty much a non-factor at that point. It's just background noise. Again, it's probably not gonna be problematically disruptive or anything like that, but it's just not gonna add anything for you. But yeah, and when it comes to comedy and jokes in general, that's something that will vary greatly from person to person. It's very hard to kind of evaluate it to some degree because it is so very subjective. So I think the best way to really evaluate if you will like the comedy or the jokes in a game or a piece of media in general really is to just kind of hear some of it and get an idea of the style of comedy and how it's delivered, essentially. At least that's usually how it is for me. And explaining jokes and comedy is not particularly funny either. It's hard to get an idea of how it actually is delivered. So I'm not so sure that's the best way to do it either. But anyways, I am going to show you a little bit more of the narrative later on, and maybe I'll throw in some clip or whatever, just to give you some sense of the narration and narrative that you can expect. When it comes to the story and narrative though, aside from that, isn't that much more to cover there on that topic. I mean, again, it's very Borderland-esque. It's not that different from the previous games. The setting is a little bit different, I suppose, but at the same time, it not that different, because it is still very much inspired by the kind of world of Borderlands and all the characteristics of that world, I suppose. A lot of the characters that you see in this game are also very much from the Borderlands world, essentially, honestly. So you find Claptrap and stuff like that as well. It's just that they have some kind of different role in this game, of course, but they're equally as obnoxious as always, essentially. Speaking of Claptrap in this case, I really don't find him particularly funny for the most part. He does have one or two amusing lines now and then on occasion, but the rest of the time he really just makes me want to throw my speakers out the window, so there you go. The characters all around this time around are pretty bland, in my opinion. I don't think I've really met a single character I really like. I think my favorite character would probably have to be Valentine, possibly, which is one of the friend persons you're playing with in the board game, yes. Which consists of you, Tiny, Tina, and 2 other people. But yeah, aside from him, I haven't really found a single character that I found to be actually legitimately amusing or interesting or fun to listen to, really. Again, some of the real-world references are funny, but like a character itself that's like, oh, this is an appealing character. I like this character. I really enjoy listening to this character. I really don't think I can mention one or tell you one that I really liked, honestly. So that's a bit unfortunate. This certainly isn't anybody even close to the level of like Handsome Jack in the quality. The banter around the board game can sometimes be somewhat amusing on occasion. It is worth keeping in mind that I'm not the biggest fan of Borderlands writing either. It's not that I hate it, it is amusing time to time, but it isn't my foremost choice when it comes to interesting, insightful story and narrative, let's say. But if you're a very big fan of Borderlands' style of storytelling and writing and narrative, well, this is very much Borderland narrative and writing, so it may very well be perfect, you know? It depends on what you prefer. You also get to choose the kind of voice and demeanor of your character. So you can like choose a super pious knight, or you can take some kind of creepy Undertaker voice or whatever. And the commentary would kind of reflect the choice you make as well. And I actually find that some of the more amusing and funny lines come from your own character. But anyways, the areas you get to explore are pretty much as diverse as they've always been in Borderlands, honestly. They've always been good at keeping a pretty good variety in the different areas and settings you get to explore. And this is a pretty silly game with a moderately important story, let's say. Narrative inconsistency and coherency is a little bit less important than it would be in more story-focused and narratively consequential games. Either way, there really isn't that much of a difference between this and previous Borderlands games, even though it might feel like it should be easier to diversify the areas of a fantastical fantasy RPG style of story, narrative setting. But honestly, the previous Borderlands games has had very diverse areas as well. In Borderlands 2, for example, you have everything from a tundra to a desert to a mining facility to a wildlife preserve. When it comes to Borderlands 3, you're just in space and, well, flew to different planets instead, so you can go wherever the fuck you want, I guess. I think the least diverse Borderlands game would have to be the pre-sequel, I think, which took place on the moon, which I guess kind of makes sense. It's not a particularly imaginative area, I guess. It's a bunch of dead rock and shit. But yeah, I mean, it's space, facilities and stuff like that, obviously, but a little bit less diversified, I guess, in the areas. But either way, in this case, yeah, it's very diversified when it comes to areas. You have this underwater environment, for example, but that's not underwater anymore because of story reasons. And then we have like graveyards and fantasy castles and a bunch of different stuff like that. There is a pretty neat kind of cliff wall that's like a big giant skull death wall, which is pretty cool that you get to kind of traverse. But yeah, so it's a decent amount of variety, I would say. To quickly mention something about the music and sounds as well, it more or less sounds the same as Borderlands has always sounded, I suppose. Most weapons are not especially impactful or weighty in their sound, they don't have too much resonance. At the same time, that makes sense, I guess. Very much a fantastical world with fantastical sounds. Everything from icicle submachine guns to infinitely firing weapons that overheat. So when it comes down to it, while the sound effects are not particularly weighty in my opinion, I also believe it makes sense for the setting. It's not a dark, gritty survival game where every single bullet should pack a punch and is the difference between life and death, right? This is a game where you fire 100 icicle bullets a second while fighting evil Skellyman. So tonally, I think it makes complete sense for the setting of the game, basically. If anything, it's even more fitting for this tabletop fantasy RPG setting. That's probably even more fantastical than the other Borderland games, I would say. When it comes to the music, it is basically on par with the other Borderland games. It's neither better nor worse, honestly. It doesn't have any track that I'm especially fond of. I really liked the track in Borderlands 2 that is for the dust, honestly. There isn't one that have really stuck with me here, as of so far, at least. And when it comes to the ambience, I mean, it's there. It's not the focus of the game. They're not trying to make a highly immersive first-person experience dripping with atmosphere. I mean, it's a fun co-op game where you blow shit up, primarily enemies. Focusing all your development effort on creating immersive soundscapes and ambience is probably a bit of a waste, honestly. But yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say about the sounds. So I'm just going to skip forward a little bit to some more dialogue and story, basically, so you can get a little bit more of a sense of how that sounds and looks, and then I think we'll wrap this up.
The Temple of the Slither Sisters is eerily quiet as you enter. I know what you're thinking, baby. What's the deal? Where are these ladies? And aren't they supposed to be singing?
I am not.
But then...
So, another fool has come to challenge us. Let us test your resolve. Ooh, I like this one. They're tough. But not tough enough to resist our siren song.
Ah, my ears! And yet, my heart feels full and warm.
Sisters, I believe we have found our champion. Champion, go and defeat, slay, kill Captain Claw.
Defeat, slay, kill, you name it, and I'll do it. Anything for you.
So, what? We're just under the spell of these coiled ladies now?
Yep, gotta do whatever they say.
Sounds just like Carol.
Do I even want to know?
Hell no.
It all started when our eyes met across a bistro on Hedon 6.
Hey, what did I just say?
I'm filled with the burning need to slay you, Captain Claw! Show yourself! My quarrel is with you, not your pets. But I'll do what I must.
Basta presto! The power of Captain Claw's bellow breaks the enchantment of the Slither Sisters.
Who are you? And where am I?
I asked myself the same thing on the day the Slither Sisters cursed me and my crab brethren with consciousness.
Fascinating. I have so many questions.
That's all consciousness is. An endless march of questions for which there are no answers. How can you stand to live like this?
You eventually learn.
It was a rhetorical question. All I want, all we want, is to return to a blissful life of scuttling to and fro without a care in the world. What a curse it is to care.
Poor crabs.
Please help us. Together we can destroy the sisters. First, you must destroy the clamplifiers. They're magical resonance boosters which amplify and strengthen the power of their song.
Now, why do you suppose the crabs couldn't destroy these clamplifiers themselves?
Excellent question.
We'd have crushed the clamplifiers ourselves, but our claws are more decorative than folks imagine. We weren't ashamed of it until those damn sisters cursed us.
I'm learning so much!
Now that you've destroyed the clamplifiers, the sisters will be able to charm you again. I'll meet you at the lair. Why don't you three slither out of that hole you hide in and face us?
Well, if it isn't our pal. Claw. How's consciousness treating you, Squirt? And our champion. We had such high hopes for you. For shame. We'll keep the crab alive to wallow in the pain of his own existence. But you... we're gonna have some fun with you.
Thank you. You are indeed a champion. With the curse lifted, I can feel my consciousness fading.
To choose a life without thought. I wonder what he knows that we don't.
Alright, that pretty much summarizes the dialogue of a side quest now. And there was some amusing dialogue and jokes in there, as far as I'm concerned. The kind of story of the quest itself was not particularly interesting or inspiring in any way. This isn't enough for a Borderlands side quest, I would say, in what it intends and aims to deliver at any rate, which is a rather comedical side story that doesn't have necessarily that much narrative substance. The focus is very much silly dialogue and humor for the most part, as opposed to profound and inspiring story. But yeah, I think that pretty much wraps it for this kind of review slash opinion piece ramble of Tiny Tina's Wonderland. Bottom line is basically, if you like Borderlands and if you want more Borderlands, then this is more Borderlands. If you're starting to get a little bit sick of it on the other hand and don't want more of the same gameplay and gameplay systems and core gameplay loop, well then this game doesn't do that much to rectify that. It is very much more the same. It is Borderlands. It gives you more Borderlands, and I think that's what most people were expecting either way. And in that regard, it certainly isn't bad. It very much serves its purpose in delivering more of the same kind of Borderlands experience. So if that's what you're looking for, then this is a great choice. But if you want something new, then it probably isn't. Nevertheless, that's most of what I had to say about it, so nothing more to be said. Well, maybe I'll see you next time.
Sully. Certainly. But the rest of them are objectively terrible. And you are wonderful. Find other wonderful cyclopi and start your own band.